During all my time on YouTube, one of the hardest tasks is getting people to understand the danger that is coming their way. I get a lot of people that leave comments claiming that everything is fine or accusing me of being a conspiracy theorist and that this cannot happen in America. These people have fallen prey to what is commonly referred to as the normalcy bias. The normalcy bias occurs when people underestimate or discount both the possibility of a disaster occurring and its possible effects. This often results in situations in which people fail to adequately prepare for a disaster, and on a larger scale, the failure of the government to include the populace in its disaster preparations. The assumption made in the case of the normalcy bias is that since a catastrophe never has occurred, it never will. People judge their future according to how things have been in the past. One of the most tragic examples of the normalcy bias is the experience of post-World War I Germany. Because of various reasons, Germany's debt skyrocketed. And in order to pay this debt, they began to borrow more and more money. And when that failed, monetize that debt or began printing money. Many well-educated and informed people warned that this debt, which was worsening on a daily basis, would lead their nation to ruin, but they kept printing. Those who warned were trivialized and labeled doom and gloom zealots, but despite the warnings, many claimed they never saw it coming. This massive monetization created a somewhat delayed but quickly unmanageable inflation in the form of rising prices of all of life's necessities. Under the forces of inflation, but due to a strong manufacturing base in Germany, businesses began operating at feverish speed, and unemployment declined and eventually disappeared, although not because the economy was healthy. However, the purchasing power of the workers dropped badly. Unions obtained frequent increases in pay, but these could not keep pace with the rising price of goods. Workers, domestics, farm workers, and various white-collar groups fared especially badly. They had no unions to fight for pay boosts for them, and often they were reduced to hunger. Many people showed visible signs of malnutrition. Skilled workers, writers, artisans, and professionals found their wages lagging until they reached the unskilled worker level, which often met the bare minimum needs to support life. Businessmen began to abandon their legitimate occupations to speculate in stocks and in goods whose value was ever increasing, but not because of an inherent increase in their value, but because it took more money to buy everything. Thousands of small businessmen tried to eke out a living by speculating in fabrics, shoes, meat, soap, clothing, and any produce or product they could obtain. Each fall in the value of the money brought a rush to the shops. People started hoarding and clearing out stores before the prices would rise again. By mid-1923, workers were being paid as often as 3 times a day. Their wives would meet them, take their money, and rush to the shops to exchange it for goods. However, by this time, more and more often, shops were empty. Storekeepers could not obtain goods or could not do business fast enough to protect their cash receipts and resupply. Farmers refused to bring produce into the city in return for worthless paper. So food riots broke out. Parties of workers marched into the countryside to dig up vegetables and to loot the farms. Businesses started to close down, and unemployment suddenly soared again. The economy was indeed collapsing around them. Meanwhile, middle-class people who depended on any sort of fixed income found themselves destitute. They sold furniture, clothing, jewelry, and works of art to buy food. Little shops became crowded with such merchandise. Hospitals, literary and art societies, charitable and religious institutions closed down as their funds disappeared. Then, by a mere effort of will, just as it started, the government stepped in and created a new currency overnight. Throughout the quote-unquote miracle of the Rentenmark, the depreciation halted in its tracks. Businesses revived. The inflationary spree was ended, although there was a nasty hangover yet to come. Millions of middle-class Germans, normally the mainstay of a republic, were ruined by the inflation. They became receptive at that point to rabid right-wing propaganda and formed a fertile soil for the rise of Hitler. Workers who had suffered through the inflation turned in many cases to the communists. The biggest beneficiaries of this enormous redistribution of wealth, however, were the feudalistic industrial leaders of the time, who distrusted democracy and who proved willing to deal with Hitler, thinking that they could control him. The democratic parties and the labor unions were demonized by those who controlled the money. A staged terrorist attack was blamed on the enemies of industry, and all rights of privacy and freedom were removed under the guise of Homeland Security. By the end of 1935, 100,000 Jews had left Germany, but 450,000 remained. Wealthy Jewish families kept thinking and hoping that the worst was over. Many of the German Jews, brilliant, cultured, cosmopolitan as they were too complacent. They had been in Germany so long and were so well established, they simply couldn't believe there was going to be a crisis that would endanger them. They were too comfortable. They believed the Nazis and anti-Semitism was an episodic event, and that Hitler's bark was worse than his bite. They reacted sluggishly to the rise of Adolf Hitler for completely understandable but tragically erroneous reasons. Events moved much faster than they could imagine. We saw the same type of calamity occurring with Hurricane Katrina. Even as it became obvious that the levee system was collapsing, thousands of people stayed in their homes directly in the line of the oncoming waves of water. The residents of New Orleans had never seen a levee failure, so they simply didn't believe it could happen. As a result, nearly 2,000 of them died in the flood. The recent housing crisis was largely triggered by a normalcy bias. Since housing prices had never declined on a national scale for more than a few months, everyone felt safe about buying a home. Even though home prices had tripled in some markets, people still believed that housing prices would only move higher. The same mindset is playing out with our own national debt right now. Despite the facts that spending is out of control, debt is at a level that have always led to bankruptcy. There is only mild concern from investors. They have only known bonds to be 100% safe. Unlike stocks, they always retain their face value. Situational awareness, my friends, is the complete opposite of the normalcy bias. It involves having a full perception of your environment and a comprehension of what may transpire in the near future and what actions to take to mitigate your situation. Because other people may seek to provide you with false information, situational awareness requires you to be the guardian of your own life and your family's life, because we only have limited control over our fate. Disaster can still strike from 1,000 directions. The fault rests with us when we see danger coming and do nothing to get out of its way. Be prepared.